Hi, this is Danny.
Dr. Danielle Herro. She's an assistant professor of digital media and learning in the Eugene T. Moore School of Education at Clemson University. She's an Edmund W. Gordon MacArthur Foundation Fellow for 21st Century Learning and Assessment and an invited Playful Learning Fellow. She teaches about social media, games, and emerging technology. Her current research involves stealth assessment in games, efficacy of teacher professional development in integrating digital media into STEAM activities.
I was a classroom teacher and then a technology coordinator in a K-6 elementary school. So I worked in a computer lab for about 13 years. And then I was a instructional technology administrator. So I got my PhD at UW-Madison. And after I got my PhD, I worked for a couple more years as the technology administrator. So I was always interested in students creating with media. And in the 90s, I'm going to say late 90s and even early 2000s, a lot of it was the tools that were available at the time, HyperStudio, Logo Writer, MicroWorlds. So some of it was programming, a lot of it in terms of HyperStudio, kind of digital storytelling, but kids would put together music and animation and photos and more than just text. And so I saw a lot of excitement through all of that, and I also ran some robotics clubs. So my interest in game-based learning really stemmed with my interest in digital media for learning, in creating, and in design. When I got to Madison, I ended up studying with Constance Steinkuhler.
So here I thought I was studying video games, and I still am, but it turns out video games are just a Trojan horse for studying interest-driven learning. So in fact, is it about the games? I don't think so. I don't think it's about the games at all, except that games are very good. They're very well designed, both for learning, but also to capture interest, to be captivating, motivating. And in schools, for example, we have the luxury of ignoring interest because we simply say, well, you must, rather than here's why it's inherently compelling. So is it about games? I don't think so. It's really funny to me that I'm still a games scholar. I run a games conference. I do everything around video games, but really, games are just an easy context to look at what it means when kids actually are engaged and care about the subject matter.
And Kurt Squire.
When you're playing a game, there's this natural inclination as you become better and better to start engaging in the world in different ways. Now, part of that is simply to recruit other people to game with, right? So if you're playing something like Civilization, there's a point at which you need to have other players to kind of push your understanding, push your strategy. Same thing in guilds or multiplayer games. What I'm most interested in, though, is this idea that when you play through a game world, let's say that you're playing as a role-playing game and you're a character who's shaped this entire world, we are starting to see some evidence that players, after playing games like this, will start to kind of put down the computer, look outside and say, well, why are things the way they are? Why is the economic system or the political system the way it is if you've been playing Civilization? So what we want to do with educational games are design games that try to do that, but really build them around critical kind of current issues and then get kids to be motivated and have the skills to go out and start to solve these problems as a direct result of having played the game.
Constance was my advisor, and she was studying digital literacies in World of Warcraft. And Kurt was doing some things with augmented reality at the time. Kurt's work was really related to game-based learning with schools and curricula. And so that, to me, and especially using a tool as just, at the time it was the handheld GPS mobiles, and now they do this augmented reality, obviously, on smartphones. But just the idea that you could extend the classroom learning by visiting a physical location and using, geolocation to find the point of interest, see what was around you, have non-playing characters pop up in this virtual or augmented reality environment to give you more information and work in a team so the kids would take on various roles while they were solving problems. But the mobile served as a tool to both record information, communicate with one another, and give them more information about what they were seeing and facilitated the gameplay. So they were in some ways creating and designing their experiences using augmented reality. In Constance's research, we were looking at, again, digital literacies in World of Warcraft, and I came in as a pretty traditional teacher in that I couldn't understand how something like World of Warcraft, which in my mind was very addictive, and yes, it had strategy, but how could that ever relate to learning goals? And what we saw were kids who would be reading, it was all the metagame stuff. They would be reading and designing these incredible things around the game. And so then of course, I started reading Jim G's work and got really interested in the principles of well-designed games. And could we apply those principles, especially with what I already knew from just watching kids over 13 to 15 years with media design? Could we apply that for some really solid learning?
Digital media, video games in particular, work just like we know books work. Now, it's all the stuff that you know about literacy is true of digital media. One thing that a lot of people who are not into games are not aware of is that today, in the way that people game socially, is the game is not the only thing at stake. Right, and if you're going to contemplate the possible use of games or digital media for learning about learning, you really have to say, wait a minute, don't just look at the game. There's more going on. Now, so I'm going to show you what it is. All right, this is World of Warcraft, 15 million players. This is the most played multiplayer game now in the world. It's a role-playing game that has some interesting properties. The basic unit is 5 people. Now, in each of the 5 people, each one has to have a deep skill set, which they've chosen to specialize in those skills. And it has to be different than the other 4. The idea, first of all, is each person must be deeply skilled in one skill set, but has to understand the big picture so they can integrate their skill set with the very different skill sets of the other people. In the world of high-tech work, this is called a cross-functional team. Now, in work, this is considered extremely high stress. Then you go home to play World of Warcraft to do it again. Games today are only half the picture, because what happens in any game that people get passionate about is they play the game and then they get interested in going on an internet site, which I will call an affinity space. I'll tell you why. And discussing that game, modifying the game, researching it, and explicating everything about it.
And so then I got finished my PhD, worked in the district a couple more years, brought in a number of curricula. So my school district was really great because I had some, legitimacy from working there so long, and they allowed me to do some game design curriculums where I wrote 2 curriculums with teachers who would be teaching them. One was an introductory course that was called Elements of Game Design for high schoolers, elective course. We surveyed the kids first to see interest. Now you see that a little bit more, but at the time, when we first started that course, it was 6 or 7 years ago, and it was really, that was something really novel at the time to offer game design in high school.
Right.
And so the kids in the course would build games, and they first did a board game, which is really common to understand the aesthetics, mechanics, dynamics, which all games are really based on. And then they created 2 digital games, one mobile, one non-mobile. We use Kodu, which is, Microsoft researchers' free download for programming. And then we offered a second course that was really geared towards game design, but some of the computational thinking principles. We saw kids at the high school not taking the computer science courses. They were very dated. So we offered a couple of courses as prereqs, elements of game design, and then an algebra course they had to take. And then they could take this higher level game design course that used App Inventor, Portal 2, and Unity. So we used a gaming engine, Unity, that really focused on the aesthetics piece. App development, because kids are really interested in developing apps, and you could take that pretty far in terms of programming.
Right.
And then Portal, math and physics, so they can design in their test chambers and really test out what it is they're doing.
These next tests require cooperation. Consequently, they have never been solved by a human. That's where you come in. You don't know pride. You don't know fear. You don't know anything. You'll be perfect.
So I did that, and the second part I did as a consultant when I worked at Clemson. I started at Clemson 4 years ago, and really started thinking about how we could change the curricula for our undergraduate and even our graduate programs to include game design as a piece of it and as, part and parcel of digital media and learning. Um, so we rewrote our undergraduate course that all students in the School of Ed have to take, but it's also offered as a, what is that called? STS. So we have students outside of the School of Ed that also take it, and a piece of that focuses on game-based learning. And the course was completely revamped to think about how we use technology and how it might apply. So whether it's talking about maker spaces, playing games, designing apps, creating with media, responsible use, ethical use of social media, it just looks entirely different than when we came in, and it was very focused on this is how you use a whiteboard, smart board. This is how
Right.
this is how you create a wiki. Things that, okay, nice to use, but you don't really need a semester on something like that. And we began our Learning Sciences program in my second year. And the Learning Sciences program is certainly not focused just on games, but because it's designed where there's a cognate area, where you have 6 courses that you can take that are really areas of specialization, we offered an area of specialization or a cognate area in digital media and learning, and I created 2 courses for that area. One is called Theoretical Foundations of Games for Learning, and the other is a critical look at social media, games, and emerging technologies. So we look at all of the theory in both courses behind digital media and games, and it's really more preparation if you want to do research into game-based learning or with digital media. And what's been done, what's out there, and we also take a look at certainly participatory cultures, all of the things that surround media-based now and futures. I think some of the issues that we still are struggling with, and this as a former educator in the K-12 system, I think I'm always an educator. Some of this makes a lot of sense. So teachers have a really difficult time in general understanding how they can remain accountable and show learning within a game.
Right.
And as you probably know, a lot of the educational games, even though there's some pretty great educational gaming companies out there right now, they smell and feel a lot different than some of the the MMOGs and some of the commercial off-the-shelf games. And so I don't think we've quite struck that sweet spot for both kids and teachers, where teachers can say, I know my kids are learning these things, and they have to learn these things. I can't just let them play a game and have it be completely disconnected and assume the learning is there because it's we're playing Civ and I'm teaching this in history or social studies and so, that's the hard part. And until you can really show that there is some learning that's valued in schools by gaming, and you can do it, I think. That it's not that it's impossible. We just haven't, I think we're working on it right now. So we're working on stealth assessments embedded in games, and, we're working on working with teachers through professional development so they actually don't just plug their kids into a game, but talk much more about how you scaffold experiences in the game is just one piece of the learning and so on.
If there's anything the Commission is unanimous about, it is that the primary purpose of assessment ought to be to inform and improve teaching and learning.
If you want to reform teaching and learning, you have to worry about assessment because it's going to drive what people are willing to do.
I think most American testing is more harmful than helpful.
I think you sit there with the thing, with the booklet, and you have to have 2 number 2 pencils.
All they focus on is just the score you get, and all they care about during the year is to raise your score.
Our current approaches have not kept pace with changes in society and coming changes in education.
I think we are on the cusp of real technology breakthroughs that will fundamentally change the way testing occurs.
I kind of think that we need to start from scratch.
This is about helping students learn. So how do you harness all this new knowledge to do that effectively?
Some of the things that we have spent a lot of time discussing, reading about, is using evidence-centered design as a means of assessment, so involving the teacher much more in the formative process of, so that may be that likely would happen outside of the game, but it's not you game and then here's the summative assessment. So the teacher would have to be more integral to that learning process. The other thing is, and Val Shute, who does a lot of work with stealth assessments, that's the other thing. You're seeing games developed with embedded assessments that actually level to where the player is, where the user is, and Google Analytics often gives you the report or where the child, the player, the student is. So I mean that's another. I mean that's a great. I think that has a lot of potential to show actual learning in games. But I think between the two of them, I mean, we already know that the assessments that we're using, especially in K-12, aren't terribly accurate, right? It's either well after the fact. It's a discrete set of skills. It's something that teachers almost look at as peripheral to real learning because the formative assessments tell them so much more. I know they brought me in because that's exactly what they wanted. We want to do something with. They didn't call it game-based learning. They said gaming, but we don't know what. We know these classes need to be reconceptualized, but we aren't exactly sure how. So they were really really great about relying on what they thought was my expertise. You need to have at least a culture established where people will allow for some, I'm not even going to call them risky ideas, but ideas that are different. If you don't have that, it's just not going to go over well. And I think in the area of technology and digital media, enough is out there where schools of education, and I know you're probably talking more broadly, schools of education are very aware of some of the initiatives towards game-based learning. They have no idea what it might look like for them, but it's been written into the educational technology plans at the federal level for the last couple of years. Yeah, the Ed Tech Plan in 2010 talked about gaming as one of the ways to move forward, and they only gave about 10 different large or broad ways that schools really needed to consider. And the other thing is they brought my advisor, Constance Stein-Kuhler, did 2 years in the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House to talk about moving games forward in education. So, I mean, it's initiatives that are a lot more widespread than you would think. ISTE, the International Society for Technology and Education, which is, probably the largest institution in terms of conferences that support K-12 work. There's always a lot around gaming at those. The convergence of different schools, so architecture, communication, rhetoric, computer science, it doesn't seem like such a scary thing when you have a number of other schools that are saying, hey, we're doing this. We're creating games for healthcare. We're studying, and I think at Clemson they offer a course on modding in Skyrim in the School of Computing. They're using MIT App Inventor. You have Cynthia Haynes, you have Jan Holmovic. So I think some of it is drawing on, a little bit of legitimacy from what's already there, and then sometimes having a little more expertise than the folks that surround you, and people put some stock into that. Well, and the other thing I was going to say is the other line of research that is related, but certainly not directly related, is I do work with STEAM, science, technology, engineering, adding the arts and humanities and math. And so that provides a nice forum for me. I mean, people really get into STEM and STEAM sort of work. And in a lot of the work I'm doing with schools, it's pretty easy to integrate game-based learning or creating or designing with media in those sorts of curriculums and environments. I mean, it's pretty seamless.
All right. Thank you.
Yep. Nice to talk with you.